Generally, applications that run on Docker containers rely on configuration values that are stored as environment variables required to start and run an application properly. And it is very important to have a good management strategy for these environment variables. When running applications locally or sometimes on a remote environment like test or production, one common strategy is creating an environment file that contains all the environment variable values injected into the application at startup. The issue with this strategy is that you run the risk of exposing sensitive information as a result of, say, accidentally pushing your environment files into your source code repository or even making them publicly accessible. And as a result, this becomes a major security flaw not just on the application but also on the infrastructure setup. Today, I will explore one option on managing these environment variables available in AWS. If you're new to this channel, I'm George and you're on Pablo Spot, a space where I show and tell practical examples and sample implementations on DevOps and cloud technology in general. In today's episode, I will be exploring the parameter store service in AWS Systems Manager to manage the environment variables on my Run Atlantis application. So, let's get into it. Let's start coding. The first thing that I will do is determine all the environment variables that I need for my Run Atlantis application. The first set of environment variables that I need are in my Docker Compose file. So let me go ahead and open that file. And then what I'm going to do next is copy all the list of the environment variables defined in my Docker Compose file. And then open my locals.tf. I'm going to add this list so we can flesh out what needs to be done for each of these environment variables. And then what I'm going to do next is I will create a local parameter called env_variables. And then also create another local parameter called secret_variables. Both of these parameters will hold environment variables. The first one are for the non-sensitive environment variables, and the second one are for the sensitive ones. And these are the ones that I need to make sure they are stored and accessed securely. The second set of environment variables are also the ones that I will store in parameter store in AWS Systems Manager. Now, let's start reviewing the environment variables and see which ones are not sensitive and which ones I have to store in parameter store. For those that I will end up identifying as non-sensitive, I will need to pass the values as input variables to my Terraform to make it a lot simpler. So the first environment variable in the list is my Atlantis URL. The Atlantis URL does not need to be managed through parameter store, so let me go ahead to my variables.tf and define my Atlantis URL variable. And now let me head back to my locals.tf. And what I will do is pull out this environment variable in here and add that inside the env_variables local parameter. And use my new input variable as a source for the value. And then I'm going back to my list and identify which other environment variables I can store as non-sensitive. The write git creds I also don't need to manage, and I will set this up as an input variable. So let me copy this and move it inside env_variables local parameter and set the source of the value from an input variable. And then I will switch to my variables.tf to define the definition for this new variable. Now back to my locals.tf. Going through the list, I also need to do the same thing for my repo allow list environment variable. And then switch to my variables.tf to define this variable. And then back to my locals.tf. The Atlantis environment variable called Atlantis repo config will need to be stored as repo config JSON. So what this means is that I need to convert the contents of my repos.yaml file into JSON and pass the result into this environment variable. So what I will do in this case is define a new local parameter called repos_JSON. The value that I will pass to this parameter is the contents of my repos.yaml that sits inside the config directory in the root of my repository, which is right here. Because the contents of this configuration file is in YAML format, I need to convert these contents into a JSON format before assigning it to the new local parameter. So let me head back to my locals.tf. And to convert my repos.yaml into a JSON formatted data, I will use the file function to fetch the contents of my repos.yaml in the config directory in the root of my repository. And then I will call the YAML decode function to parse the data into something that Terraform understands. And then finally, I will call the JSON encode function to derive the JSON formatted string. I can then use the value of my repos_JSON local parameter to assign it to the repos config environment variable. So let me copy that environment variable, which is right here. And fetch the value from the repos_JSON local parameter. Now let me go back to my list of environment variables. So what's left are all environment variables that contain sensitive information. Before I start moving all these environment variables that contain sensitive information, I would like to point out that this environment variable that's called Atlantis gh app key file will need to be renamed to just gh app key. When I set up my Atlantis app in ECS later on, I need to store my GitHub app key file as a string. And so I need to drop the underscore file at the end of this environment variable. The other thing that I'd like to point out is I have an environment variable in here called AWS session token. And I don't need to add this environment variable in my list. This is because having the access key ID and the secret access key should be enough for me to allow my Atlantis to integrate with AWS. And now that I've finalized the remaining environment variables, let me quickly clean this up. And then move them all inside my secret underscore variables local parameter. There are other environment variables that I need to add to my list, which will be needed when I set up my Atlantis application with ECS. And now that I have a clear separation of environment variables that are sensitive and not sensitive, I can now start looking at creating the necessary parameter store resources for the environment variables that I want to put inside parameter store securely. So let me head to my main.tf. And what I will do first is start looking at setting up my AWS access key and AWS secure access key. I want to use a separate AWS IAM user for my Atlantis service. So what I will do is create an AWS IAM resource. This resource needs a name property, which I am going to set to PS Atlantis user. I want this user to be added to a pre-existing IAM group that I use for deployment process in AWS. So what I will do is create a new resource for user group membership. This resource needs a user property, which I am going to point to my new IAM user. This resource also needs a groups property, which accepts a list. I need to add a data reference to the existing group name on my AWS account. So let me head to my data.tf. And define that data reference. I am going to make this implementation as simple as possible, so for now, I will explicitly set the value of the group name property with the group name that I have defined in my AWS account. And now I'm going to head back to my main.tf. I can then add the data reference to my existing group name inside this group's property. And now that I have an IAM user, the next thing I will do is generate an access key and secret for this user. So I will add a new resource called IAM access key. I am going to set the user property in this resource and point this to my new IAM user. Note that this resource block is the one responsible in generating my access key and my secret access key. So what I'm going to do now is I will fetch this access key and secret out of this resource and store them in parameter store. So what I will do is start with the access key. I will create a new SSM parameter resource. This resource needs a name, type, and value. For the name property, I will set this to the same environment variable that my Atlantis application requires and prefix this with /Atlantis. I am going to set the type property to secure string. And for the value, I will use the ID property from my access key resource. What I need to do next is create my SSM parameter store resource for my AWS secret key. So what I will do is duplicate this existing resource block and then I am going to replace the arbitrary name of this resource. And then update the name property with the appropriate environment variable name. The type property remains the same, but the value I will fetch from the secret property on my AWS access key resource. Now, let me head to my locals.tf. And because I defined a different set of parameter store resources for my AWS access key and secrets, I will remove this from the list. And then I am going to change this secret underscore variables from being a map to a list. And then I am going to update this further to contain a list of all the environment variables that I want managed in parameter store. And now that I have this list, let me head back to my main.tf. And then I am going to duplicate this resource block and change the arbitrary name. And then this is where we start making use of for each block to create multiple resources out of a single resource block. And I will use the value of my secret variable's local parameters as the source. And because this is a list, I will call the toSet function to convert this to a set. Each element inside the for loop contains the actual environment variable string name. So what I will do to set the name property is replace what I have defined in here with the key value of the each property. So it would look like this. The type property remains the same as secure string. However, Because I will be setting the right value for these environment variables outside of Terraform, I will set a default value to unset. This is just my way of indicating that a right value needs to be assigned inside that parameter store resource. And now that everything is set, let me switch to my VS Code terminal. And I will start creating all these infrastructure resources. So let me start by exporting my TF workspace as usual. And then initialize my AWS credentials using AWS Vault. And then run Terraform init. And then Terraform plan. And then run Terraform apply. And now let me switch to my browser and then head to my AWS Web Console. And then on the search field, I'm going to start typing parameter store. And then select the parameter store feature. And then make sure that I'm on the right region, which is Sydney. And now I am going to verify that my parameter store records are created. And so on the search field, I'm going to type Atlantis. And they're all there. Both my AWS access key and secret are automatically set inside my infrastructure code. However, the rest of my parameter store entries have default values of unset, which I need to update to have the appropriate values set before I can start using them for my application. So let me update one of these environment variables. Let's say I want to update the Atlantis GH app ID. So I'm going to click that. And notice that by default, the value is encrypted. And this is because the type that we set inside the resource block is secure string. If I have the appropriate permission set in AWS, I will be able to click this show link under the value and display the decrypted version of the string. What I'm going to do is edit this value and change it to something else. And then save my changes. Without doing anything with my infrastructure code, this setup has a problem. Let me switch to my VS Code terminal and show you what the problem is. If I rerun Terraform plan, I am expecting that nothing will change since I have not made any changes to my infrastructure code. And let's have a look at the result. My Terraform plan result tells me that there's a change in my infrastructure. And this is because Terraform has picked up a change on the value field on one of my parameter store records. So how would I fix this? So let me adjust this back. And then head to my code. Because I'm managing the values of these parameter store resources outside of my code, I need to set up a way to tell Terraform not to pick up changes to the values field on the resource block. This is where the lifecycle property in a resource comes to play. This block has several properties that you can use, but what I need for my specific use case is a property called ignore changes. This property accepts a list of resource properties that Terraform will ignore when checking for changes in the infrastructure. So I want Terraform to ignore changes to the value property, so I will add this in the list. So now, if I head back to my VS Code terminal and rerun Terraform plan, my Terraform plan result now shows that nothing has changed. And I can then go away and update the rest of my parameter store entries to prepare for setting up my Atlantis application in ECS. And that's all I have for today. On the next episode, I will look into all the necessary resources that I need to set up my Run Atlantis application in ECS. In the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and send me some likes if you find this useful. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you like the content on this channel. Until next time, keep learning and stay safe. See ya.